Some wrestlers snap in the ring, some snap in a bar, some snap once in their entire career and spend the rest of their lives trying to live it down. But this man snapped more times than most fans ever realized. He was a former United States Army Ranger, a student of the legendary killer Kowalski. And when something crossed the wrong line, whether it was a jobber in the ring, a promoter with a knife, or two men attacking a stranger in a parking lot, the wrestling world learned what happened when the switch got flipped. In this video, we count down the top 5 times he snapped for real. Real life, unscripted moments when the man behind the character took over completely. Moments that changed his career, moments that changed his body, and one moment that would leave him bleeding out in an Atlanta parking lot with 2 bullets buried in his neck and shoulder. His name was Perry Arthur Saturn. He was born on October 25, 1966, in Cleveland, Ohio. Growing up, he learned violence young. He would later describe growing up in what he called the hood, and he would credit the streets with teaching him how to handle himself long before anyone ever taught him how to work a headlock. At 17, he enlisted in the United States Army, not just the regular Army either. He would go on to become a certified graduate of the U.S. Army Ranger School and served with the United States Army Rangers. That is not a small credential. Ranger School is one of the most physically and mentally demanding training courses on the planet. It is designed specifically to break men down and rebuild them as small unit combat leaders. The men who make it through are legitimately dangerous. That was Perry. After his 4 years in the military, he came home. He finished a bachelor's degree, and then he took a job managing a nightclub in Boston. And it was there, working the door with a bouncer named George Cayazzo, that professional wrestling found him. Cayazzo mentioned that he had always wanted to try wrestling. Perry, who had been dabbling with the idea himself, encouraged him to give it a shot. They both ended up at Killer Kowalski's wrestling school in Malden, Massachusetts, around 1988. Kowalski's school produced Triple H, Chyna, and dozens of others. It was known for one thing above all: toughness. Perry took the name Saturn from the Roman god of the harvest. Cayazzo took the name of Saturn's Greek equivalent and became John Cronis. Together they became the Eliminators, and they would go on to hold the ECW World Tag Team titles 3 times. That is the man, Army Ranger, Kowalski trainee, Boston bouncer. A guy who could look at a man like the bald, tattooed, ring-eyed face of Perry Saturn and know that behind the face was somebody who had already lived several different lives, each one harder than the last. So with that in mind, let us start with number 5. And a moment that shows you what happens when Perry Saturn decides someone is not pulling their weight. Number 5. The Cronis Ultimatum. To understand why this incident mattered, you first have to understand what John Cronis meant to Perry Saturn. Cronis wasn't just another tag team partner or a co-worker in the wrestling business. He was Saturn's closest friend, someone who had been with him long before either man became known to wrestling fans. Their story began outside a Boston nightclub, where Saturn spotted Cronis working the door and believed he had the size and athleticism to make it in professional wrestling. Saturn personally encouraged him to give it a shot and sent him to train under the legendary Killer Kowalski, helping launch the career that would eventually change both of their lives. From that point on, they were inseparable. They shared a cramped starter apartment, survived on just $40 a week while wrestling for Jerry Lawler's USWA, and often slept 4 people to a room because that was all they could afford. They endured long road trips, tiny crowds, and constant uncertainty, always believing that one day they would make it to the top together. Those struggles forged a bond that went far beyond wrestling. They weren't simply teammates chasing championships. They were brothers chasing the same dream. By the time they reached ECW and became the Eliminators, their friendship had already been built through years of sacrifice, loyalty, and shared hardship. That history made everything that happened afterward far more heartbreaking. They had built the Eliminators together from absolutely nothing. They had gone from 40 a week to 100% raise. They had captured the ECW World Tag Team Championship 3 separate times. They had toured Japan for Genichiro Tenryu's Wrestle Association R promotion. They had a finisher, Total Elimination, that Paul Heyman built an entire tag team division around. In a place like ECW, where legends were made and broken every single week, The Eliminators were untouchable. And then, on May 31st, 1997, in Trenton, New Jersey, everything changed. During a three-way dance against the Dudley Boys and PG-13, Saturn threw a kick at Big Dick Dudley. His foot landed on a crutch that was being used as a weapon at ringside, and his ACL tore in half. The doctors told him the recovery would take up to a year. Perry did not accept that. He was back rehabbing within 2 months. He was back in action by August. Not 100%, not even close, but he was there. Because that was who he was. He would drag his body through hell if that was what it took to keep working. And while Perry was clawing his way back, he started to notice something about his best friend. Something he did not like at all. Cronis was not putting in the work. He was not in the gym. He was not sharpening his craft. He was not treating this business, the business they had built together from nothing, with the respect Perry felt it deserved. Perry never said the exact words in public for years, but the story eventually came out. Perry described Cronis as a lazy addict. In his own eyes, Cronis had checked out. And Perry Saturn was not the kind of man who could keep dragging dead weight up the mountain with him. Not for a paycheck, not for a friendship, not for anything. When Paul Heyman offered him a release from his ECW contract, Perry took it. He walked away from the Eliminators. He walked away from 3-time tag team gold. He walked away from the man he had recruited off the floor of a Boston nightclub. And when WCW came calling later that year and offered him money to reform the Eliminators, Perry refused. He wanted to be a singles wrestler. He wanted to build something on his own. Something he could control. Something that did not depend on someone else showing up sober. For years, wrestling fans looked at that decision and shook their heads. They thought Perry had made a mistake. That he could have made much more money as one half of a team than as a mid-card singles guy in WCW. But those fans did not understand the code Perry Saturn was operating under. They did not understand that when a man believes in something, whether it is his craft, his art, or his oath to the Rangers, he cannot stand by while someone else disrespects it. Not even someone he loves. That was the first time the wrestling world saw Perry Saturn cut someone loose. It was not violent. It was not loud. But it was a snap all the same. A quiet, cold, permanent snap. And it told you everything you needed to know about how he would handle every conflict that came after it. But as significant as that decision was, it was nothing compared to what happened when someone in WCW's front office decided to threaten Perry Saturn in his own workplace. And that brings us to number 4. Number 4. The Mike Graham knife incident. By the tail end of 1999, the internal politics inside World Championship Wrestling had reached a boiling point. The company was hemorrhaging money. Ratings were slipping. Talent was miserable. And a small group of the best in-ring workers in the entire industry were on the verge of walking out the door. Perry Saturn was right in the middle of it. He was part of the Revolution, the on-screen stable alongside Chris Benoit, Dean Malenko, and Shane Douglas. But he was also part of a much more consequential real-life group. The core of what would soon become known as the Radicals. Him, Benoit, Malenko, Eddie Guerrero. They had a problem, and the problem had a name. Kevin Sullivan. Sullivan was set to become head booker of WCW, and the group knew what that meant. Sullivan had made it clear he did not see them as needle movers. He did not think Perry Saturn could get over with the fans. He had once said it to Perry's face. And on top of all that, Chris Benoit was involved in a real-life relationship with Sullivan's estranged wife, Nancy. Working for Kevin Sullivan was not a career option. It was a career death sentence. So Perry, being Perry, did something about it. He went to the office. He went to Bill Bush, the senior vice president of the company, and he raised his concerns directly. That was who Perry was. He did not gossip. He did not conspire. He did not whisper in hallways. If he had a problem, he walked into the office and he said it to the boss's face. And apparently, that made certain people in the WCW power structure very unhappy. Enter Mike Graham. Mike Graham was a longtime WCW road agent, a veteran of the business, a man with strong opinions, and apparently an interesting way of expressing them. Certain people in the office got Graham worked up about Saturn going over their heads. about Saturn embarrassing the agent structure, about Saturn making waves. And then, at some point during that period, Mike Graham walked up to Perry Saturn and started asking questions. Questions about what he had told Bill Bush. Questions about whether he did not want to work with Kevin Sullivan. Questions with an edge to them. Perry Saturn, being Perry Saturn, answered honestly. He told Graham that Sullivan was not their agent anymore. That was the reality of it. That was the truth. And that is when Mike Graham reached for a knife. Perry has told this story in a couple of different interviews over the years, and every time he tells it, you can hear the way it still sits with him. Not fear. Not exactly. Just this quiet incredulity that a middle-aged agent in the professional wrestling business had pulled an actual blade on him in a professional workplace. This is where Perry Saturn's response tells you everything you need to know about the man. He did not draw down. He did not throw a punch. He did not even raise his voice. He just looked at the man with the knife and made a decision. Then he called the police. He called the police and asked to have charges pressed against Mike Graham. Not because he was scared. Not because he needed protection, but because the wrestling business ran on codes, and one of those codes was that you did not pull a weapon on a colleague. That was the line. That was where the whole thing stopped being a workplace disagreement and became a criminal act. And Perry Saturn, the Army Ranger, the man who had lived his entire life around actual violence, understood exactly where that line was. Now, in a lot of these Perry Saturn stories, the snap you are looking for is a physical one. This one is different. This one is the sound of a man refusing to be intimidated, refusing to play the game, refusing to pretend that a knife pulled in a workplace was somehow just how the business worked. Kevin Sullivan and the whole old guard of WCW had assumed that this crew of technical wrestlers, these so-called vanilla midgets, could be handled, could be pushed, could be scared into keeping their heads down and their mouths shut. Perry Saturn's response to the Mike Graham knife incident was a very clear message. You cannot scare this man. You cannot intimidate this man. If you come at him with a blade, he will pick up the phone and call actual law enforcement because he is a former Army Ranger and he does not play kids' games. And that message would echo through the entire company within a matter of weeks. Because Perry Saturn's willingness to draw hard lines was about to trigger the biggest talent walkout in the history of the Monday Night Wars. Number 3. The Radicals' mutiny. If Perry Saturn had one gift outside the ring, it was this. He knew when a situation was broken beyond repair, and he knew how to make other people see it too. By January of 2000, everyone in the WCW locker room knew Kevin Sullivan was about to be given the head booker position. Everyone. And everyone knew what that would mean for the technical wrestlers. It would mean the glass ceiling stayed exactly where it was. It would mean the workhorses of the show, the men putting on the best matches every single week, would remain buried in the mid-card while aging main eventers ran the show into the ground. Chris Benoit was terrified. He believed his push to the top would be crushed the second Sullivan officially had the pen. Dean Malenko was fed up. Eddie Guerrero was ready to leave for greener pastures. But it was Perry Saturn who understood how to actually leverage the moment. The Saturday night before the sold-out pay-per-view, a group of them got together and made a plan. They would issue an ultimatum. They would go to Bill Bush as a united front and demand their releases if Kevin Sullivan was going to be the booker. Not one guy asking to be let go, not two. All of them, together, simultaneously. The original group was bigger than the eventual four. It included Benoit, Malenko, Guerrero, Perry, plus Conan, Billy Kidman, and Shane Douglas. 7 names. 7 of the most talented workers in the entire company, walking into the office and telling the senior vice president that they were done. Bill Bush was completely unprepared. He asked them to wait a week. He tried to buy time. He was scrambling. He knew this was the kind of story that could get out to the wrestling press. He knew a mass walkout of technical wrestlers would be another death rattle for a company that was already circling the drain. But by Sunday afternoon, half the group had gotten cold feet. Losing a guaranteed WCW contract in early 2000 was not a small thing. Conan and Douglas had baggage with the WWE that made a jump complicated. Kidman had a young family. When the moment of truth came, only 4 men held the line: Benoit, Malenko, Guerrero, and Perry Saturn. Perry was the immovable object in that group. He had been the one talking to Bill Bush directly. He had been the one refusing to be intimidated by Mike Graham. He was not there to negotiate a better spot on the card. He was there because he had made a decision, and once Perry Saturn made a decision, that decision was concrete. On January 19, 2000, Bill Bush granted unconditional releases to Chris Benoit, Eddie Guerrero, Dean Malenko, and Perry Saturn. 12 days later, on January 31st, they walked out onto the front row of a live Monday Night Raw is War in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The Road Dogg literally fell into their laps, and professional wrestling changed forever. The Radicals' debut was more than just a talent trade. It was, as multiple wrestling historians have described it, one of the most crippling blows WCW ever suffered. They had lost the heart of their show. The morale in the locker room collapsed. It confirmed everything the industry had been whispering about the direction of the company, and it accelerated the death of WCW by more than a year. Perry Saturn was not the most famous member of the Radicals. He would not have the highest ceiling once they got to WWE. But he had done something that most wrestlers in that era simply could not do. He had looked at a broken system and refused to keep working inside it. He had walked into an executive's office as a working-class Army Ranger from Cleveland and dictated terms to the senior vice president of a Ted Turner subsidiary. The wrestlers in WCW had one very direct way of describing this kind of behavior. They called it going into business for yourself. And it was usually said with a sneer. It was usually meant as a criticism. Perry Saturn heard it as a compliment, because in his experience, if you did not go into business for yourself, nobody else was going to look out for you. But the WWE was not exactly going to be a soft landing for Perry Saturn, because his most infamous snap was still to come. And it would happen on a night when the cameras were rolling. Number 2. The Atlanta parking lot. To tell this next story, we have to jump forward, past the Radicals' debut, past Perry's run as European champion, past the hardcore title reigns, past the incident that will become number 1 on this list, past his final release from the company in November of 2002, past his year working for TNA and touring Europe for World Wrestling All-Stars against Sabu. By April of 2004, Perry Saturn was living in Atlanta. He was mostly retired from major wrestling. He was working the independent circuit when the bookings came in. He was, by most accounts, a man in transition, trying to figure out what the second half of his life was going to look like. And on one particular night, in one particular parking lot, the man behind the character made a decision that would rewrite the rest of his story. Perry has told this story a few different times, with a few different framings. The most detailed version came in an interview with the former WWE star Maven. Perry described it very calmly. He had given a woman he knew a ride home to her workplace. He had dropped her off. He was leaving the lot when he heard a woman screaming. His first thought, he admitted later, was that it was just 2 women fighting. He almost kept driving. But something about it did not sit right with him. And so, being Perry Saturn, he turned around and went to check. What he found was not 2 women fighting. What he found was 2 men on the ground with a woman between them. What he found was an active sexual assault in progress. Perry did not hesitate. He was a ranger. He was a former nightclub bouncer. He was Killer Kowalski trained. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life in situations that other people avoided. He walked straight up to one of the attackers and shoved him hard. He tried to grab the second one. And then the second one turned around and Perry felt what he thought was a punch to the neck. It was not a punch. It was a .25 caliber round from a small handgun. It had entered the back of his neck. His body did not immediately register what had happened, because that is the way real gunshot wounds work in real life. There is no dramatic collapse. There is a burning sensation, and there is a little bit of confusion, and there is the fact that your body is still filled with adrenaline and does not want to shut down yet. Perry kept fighting. He got hit again, this time in the shoulder. He later admitted, in his U-Shoot interview, that the second shot felt exactly like a punch. He did not know he was being shot. He just knew he was in a fight, and he was not going to stop until the woman was safe. By the time the police arrived, Perry Saturn had physically driven off both attackers. He had freed the woman. He was standing in that parking lot with 2 bullets in his body, bleeding, still not entirely sure what had just happened to him. The full scale of the damage only became clear at the hospital. His cervical spine, the vertebrae at C5, C6, and C7 had been severely damaged. He would eventually need a steel plate and 3 stainless steel screws to hold his neck together. The bullets had come within inches of paralyzing him, within inches of killing him outright. One of the attackers was arrested and charged with attempted murder and rape. And Perry Saturn, the man who had just intervened in a violent felony and stopped an assault at gunpoint, went home to a life that was about to fall apart completely. Because the pain of the injuries was overwhelming. He could not work. He could barely move. He was in a halo brace, arm in a sling, sitting in an apartment with nothing to do but think about what had happened to him. And so, like a lot of men in a lot of situations far less dramatic than this, he turned to something to numb it. And in his case, that something was methamphetamine. He got addicted fast. He got homeless faster. He would later tell Bill Apter in a 2010 interview that he did not just fall into drug use, he did meth by the tons. It took over his entire life. He ended up sleeping under bridges. He ended up looking through trash cans for food. He ended up working for his own drug dealer just to keep the supply coming. 2 full years of complete homelessness. Then a brief period of sobriety and a return to an apartment. Then a relapse. Then another 6 months on the streets. Then, finally, the decision that he had to change. The wrestling world did not know where he was for a long time. Many of his colleagues assumed he was dead. When Bill Apter finally caught up with him at K&S WrestleFest in 2010, Apter was visibly shocked to see him alive. That is the price Perry Saturn paid for one snap decision in a parking lot in Atlanta. 2 bullets, a steel plate in his neck, a traumatic brain injury, years of homelessness, meth addiction, the near total destruction of his career and his health. And when interviewers asked him afterwards whether he ever regretted his decision, whether he ever wished he had just kept driving that night, the answer was always the same. He never wished he had done it differently. He would do it exactly the same way if he was put back into that parking lot at the exact same moment. Because he was who he was, and there was no way for a man like that to keep driving past a woman screaming for help. That is the second entry on this list. That is what happens when a former Army Ranger's protective instincts snap on completely in real time. And it is one of the most consequential real-life moments in the history of the wrestling business. But it is not number 1, because number 1 is not about him defending someone else. Number 1 is about him losing his cool on a much smaller stage, against a much smaller opponent, for reasons that had absolutely nothing to do with heroism. And it would be the moment that arguably defined his entire career for the wrong reasons. Number 1. The Mike Bell Massacre. May 7, 2001. WWE taping. A B-show called Jacked and Metal that was used mostly to give jobs to enhancement talents and to keep secondary stars warm between pay-per-views. The audience in the arena was a fraction of the size of a Raw crowd. The stakes, in theory, were low. Perry Saturn was assigned an enhancement match. His opponent was Mike Bell. Bell was one of those journeymen who worked the fringes of the business, taking bookings for WWE as a match-to-match enhancement guy since the early 1990s, working briefly for ECW in its dying days. He was there to make a made star look good. That was the job. It was not glamorous, but it was work, and Bell had done it before. Terry Runnels walked Perry Saturn to the ring. The bell rang, and Perry, who had wrestled in front of far larger crowds and against far more dangerous opponents in his life, went to work. They started with chain wrestling, some arm drags, some basic exchanges. Nothing that should have caused any trouble. And then Mike Bell tried to take Perry over with an arm drag. He botched it, badly. Perry landed almost directly on the top of his head. For a professional wrestler, that is one of the 2 or 3 most dangerous things that can happen in a match. Landing on the top of your head compresses your spine. It can crack vertebrae. It can end careers. It can, in the worst cases, end lives. And every wrestler in the world, when it happens to them, has a split second where their brain has to make a decision. Stay in the match. Let it go. Or, alternatively, let something else take over. something else took over in Perry Saturn. He got up. He got up fast, and he started laying the lumber on Mike Bell in the corner. Not working, not selling, not doing the choreographed dance that professional wrestling requires. He was throwing real strikes at a man who was there to lose. Receipts, as the old wrestlers call them. Punches designed not to move the story forward but to hurt. Then he threw Bell out of the ring, but not the normal way. He threw him with real momentum, full force. And because of the geometry of the throw and the speed of it, Mike Bell landed on the outside floor, head first. Pause on that for a second. This is a man who has just been dropped on his head inside the ring, being thrown headfirst onto the outside floor by an angry Army Ranger. If there had not been protective padding on the floor. In the words of the multiple witnesses and analysts who have written about this match, Mike Bell would very likely not have gotten up again. And Perry was not done. He came out of the ring. He set Bell up like he was going to hit an inverted atomic drop, one of the standard wrestling moves that lets you look tough without actually hurting your opponent. Instead, he took the extra half a step and drove Mike Bell full force onto the exposed steel ring steps. Steel ring steps are not padded. They are not designed to be taken bumps on. They are one of the 2 or 3 most feared props at ringside, and every wrestler knows it. Perry planted Mike Bell on those steps like he was trying to put him through them. He was still not done. He rolled Bell back into the ring. He hung him upside down on the top turnbuckle. And then he walked around to the outside and started pulling backwards on Bell's neck, cranking his spine. Using the leverage of the ropes and his own body weight to bend a man who had already been dropped on his head, thrown outside headfirst, and driven onto steel stairs. The only reason it stopped was Terry Runnels. She could see it. She could see her real-life colleague was not there anymore. She got Perry's attention. She talked him down. She got him focused enough to hit a super kick and a fisherman's suplex variation to actually end the match. Then, in a moment that some fans have described as either extremely unprofessional or slightly comedic, depending on your point of view, Terry Runnels kicked Bell on the way out for good measure. Perry got the pin, but the match was already over as a piece of professional wrestling. What everyone had just watched was a shoot, a real fight. Perry Saturn losing control on live tape. The tape from that match still exists. It has been rewatched and analyzed thousands of times online. And every time it gets rewatched, the same thing happens. Wrestling fans who have never seen a real shoot in their lives get very quiet very fast. Because you can tell. You can tell within about 10 seconds. The strikes are different. The body language is different. The way Perry's eyes are focused is different. He is not performing for a camera anymore. He is dealing with a threat. Backstage, Vince McMahon was reportedly furious. And when Vince McMahon was furious in the 2001 WWE, careers changed shape overnight. Steve Austin, who had recently had his own neck badly damaged by a botched Owen Hart piledriver, went on record saying that Perry had done exactly the wrong thing. In Austin's telling, when a green guy messes up in the ring, you settle him down. You put him in a rest hold. You choke him out a little bit, sure, if you have to get his attention. But you do not go into business for yourself. You do not blow up a man's night because your ego got dented. Kurt Angle would later say the same thing on his podcast. You could scare a young guy. You could tighten up. You could send a message. But what Perry did was not a message. What Perry did was a beating. Perry himself has been honest about it in interviews since. He has said that when he landed on his head, he lost track of where he was. He came up swinging because he did not know exactly what had happened to him. And once he realized what he was doing, he was mostly done. But he has never fully hidden behind that explanation. He has admitted, in his own words, that he screwed up, that he lost his cool, that he got heat from Vince McMahon after the match, and that he owned it. But owning it did not save his career, because from that moment forward, Perry Saturn's on-screen life in the WWE changed forever. Within a week, he was written into a storyline where the APA legit beat him down, complete with double power bombs after the bell had already rung. Then he took a Raven Effect DDT that further sold the concussion angle. Then he took a super kick from Lance Storm to the head. Then he took another one from Steve Blackman. Every single week for a stretch, he was taking hard shots to the head on television. And then came the gimmick. He started uttering the phrase, "You're welcome" at odd moments. He started saying non-sequiturs about doggies eating applesauce to save the ozone layer. And most infamously, he fell in love with a mop. Moppy, that was her name. The love of Perry Saturn's on-screen life. An inanimate mop that he carried around, cared for, and eventually chose over Terry Runnels. Terry would then align with Raven to enact her revenge by throwing Moppy into a wood chipper. Perry would win a feud with Raven at Unforgiven in September of 2001. And by the end of that year, one of the most legitimately tough professional wrestlers of his entire generation was reduced to a comedy character carrying around a cleaning tool. There is a debate that has raged in the wrestling community for 2 decades now about whether the Moppy gimmick was actually a direct punishment for the Mike Bell match. Perry himself has said in some interviews that he does not know for sure whether it was punishment. In other interviews, he has strongly implied that it was. Kurt Angle, on his podcast, has stated flatly that WWE punished Perry for the incident. Almost every other wrestling insider who has commented on it agrees. Either way, the practical result was the same. Perry Saturn, former Army Ranger, ECW World Tag Team Champion, WCW Television Champion, WWE European Champion, one of the 4 men who had crippled World Championship Wrestling on their way out the door, spent the last chapter of his Major League Wrestling career playing a brain-damaged man who was romantically involved with a mop. That is the price of a real snap in a professional wrestling ring in front of a Vince McMahon who valued control above almost anything else. Perry Saturn learned that lesson the hard way. And it is why the Mike Bell match sits at number 1 on this list. Because more than any other single incident in his career, it defined what came next. It cost him more than the shooting. It cost him more than the Cronis breakup. It cost him more than the Radicals walkout. In one 3-minute stretch of angry television against an enhancement talent, Perry Saturn snapped hard enough to reshape the last 2 years of his WWE run. And there you have it. 5 incredible moments where the legendary Perry Saturn snapped and showed the wrestling world what happened when the switch got flipped. From cutting his best friend John Cronis loose in 1997 because a lazy addict could not be dragged up the mountain any further, to calling the police on WCW road agent Mike Graham after a knife got pulled in the workplace, to leading the Radicals walkout that helped bury World Championship Wrestling, to catching 2 bullets in an Atlanta parking lot because he was congenitally incapable of driving past a woman screaming for help, and finally, to the infamous Mike Bell match that turned him into a warning story for every enhancement talent who has ever laced up boots since. What becomes clear when you look at all these incidents together is that Perry Saturn was not a hothead. He was not a loose cannon firing in all directions. Every so-called snap had a trigger. Disrespect for the craft. A weapon pulled on him in a workplace. A booker who thought he could be intimidated. An active sexual assault happening 10 feet from his car. A rookie who dropped him on his head and never bothered to check if he was breathing. In his own way, Perry Saturn had a code. A very specific, very old-fashioned, very working-class code. You show up. You do the work. You handle your business face-to-face. You do not stand by when someone weaker is being attacked. You do not let dead weight drag you down. And you do not, under any circumstances, allow yourself to be pushed by anybody who thinks the color of a WCW office paycheck makes them more important than the people doing the work. That code cost him a lot. It cost him his tag team. It cost him the last stretch of his WWE career. It cost him his neck, his health, and, for a long time, his home. It cost him years of his life to methamphetamine addiction. It cost him the kind of Hall of Fame legacy that some fans still argue he should have received. But Perry Saturn would not have traded any of it. Because that code was who he was. It was the thing the Army had taught him. It was the thing the streets of Cleveland had taught him. It was the thing Killer Kowalski had taught him. Take care of your people. Handle your business. Never let anybody see you flinch. And in the years since he re-emerged from homelessness, married his current wife Lisa in 2009, and started rebuilding a life away from the ring, that code has continued to define him. He has been open about his traumatic brain injuries. He has been open about his addiction recovery. He has been open about the parts of his career he handled badly and the parts of his life he still struggles with. In May of 2026, he even launched his own YouTube channel, Perry Saturn Official, where he tells these stories himself, in his own voice, without the filter of a wrestling promotion or a shoot interview producer. Wrestlers of his generation still speak about him with a particular kind of respect. Not the kind that goes to the biggest star in the room. The other kind. The kind that goes to the man in the corner who nobody wanted to test. Chris Jericho has told stories about him. Kurt Angle has told stories about him. Even the men he legitimately shot on in a ring, decades later, still describe him as a fundamentally decent human being, who occasionally lost control in ways he should not have. The Kowalski School students, the veterans who rode the WCW road with him, the radicals who walked out of Atlanta with him, they all seem to arrive at the same conclusion. Perry Saturn was, for better and worse, exactly the man he appeared to be. And maybe that is the real story of Perry Saturn. Not the moppy gimmick, not the dress angle with Chris Jericho at Sold Out, not the fact that he was arguably the fourth or fifth most famous member of a stable that also contained Chris Benoit and Eddie Guerrero. The real story is that beneath every one of those angles, there was a former Army Ranger who kept refusing to be less than himself, even when it cost him everything. They do not make them like Perry Saturn anymore. The industry does not really allow it. Modern wrestlers are more polished, more careful, more media trained. They know how to protect enhancement talent. They know how to smile through backstage disagreements. They know how to keep their real selves buried underneath a marketable character. But every once in a while, when an old-timer starts telling stories about the Attitude Era, or the last dying days of WCW, or the Wild West of 1990s ECW, Perry Saturn's name comes up. Usually because somebody remembers the Mike Bell match, or the Atlanta parking lot, or the Mike Graham knife, or the Cronis split, or the walkout. And when his name comes up, there is a certain kind of silence that follows it. The kind of silence that only comes when a room full of veterans agrees, without needing to say it out loud, that they are talking about somebody who was legitimately different from the rest of them. Somebody who could not be worked. Somebody who could not be intimidated. Somebody who, when the switch got flipped, meant every single thing he did. Perry Saturn was a lot of things. A Ranger, a tag team champion, a television champion, a European champion, a hardcore champion, a drug addict, a homeless man, a hero, a cautionary tale, a survivor. But more than anything else, he was a man who never learned how to be less than himself. Not for a paycheck, not for a promotion, not for a shot at the main event, not for anything. And in a business built almost entirely on pretending, that is maybe the most valuable thing a wrestler can be. Like and subscribe for more hard-hitting wrestling documentaries. Until next time.